So welcome to the Oaks and Prairies Joint Venture Grassland Bird ID webinar. My name is Anna Matthews. I'm the science coordinator for the Oaks and Prairies Joint Venture, and I work for American Bird Conservancy. I'll be your host / instructor for this webinar. And I've also got a few assistants, Jim Giacomo, the coordinator for the Oaks and Prairies Joint Venture, also under American Bird Conservancy, and Steve Riley, our conservation delivery specialist under Texas Parks and Wildlife. Both of them will be helping me keep an eye on the chat. So if you have questions during the webinar, feel free to put them into the chat. If they can, Jim or Steve will try to answer them, or they'll pass them along to me so I can answer them. So we will go ahead and keep moving on here. See if I can get this to change. There we go. Okay. Again, my name is Anna. If you're just tuning in, we will be listening to a lot of bird songs today. So just be aware you might need to turn up the volume on your phone or on your computer in order to hear some of them. If I'm like being really loud or something and I need to turn my voice down a little bit, just let me know and I'll try to speak a little softer. Most of the photos that you're going to see do come from Cornell and Audubon, so some of them will look pretty familiar. There are a few scattered in that come from our staff, but the majority that you'll see are Cornell and Audubon photos. I have a kind of really basic agenda for us. This webinar is going to be broken into 2 parts, and we'll have a 10-minute break kind of at the halfway point. And it looks like we're probably going to have somewhere around, I don't know how many participants we have right now, probably close to 30. Yep, 30. So that's a little more than we can really do for like introducing all of ourselves over the phone. But if you would like to put your name and where you're from and what you do into the chat, I think it would be really interesting to see who all is tuning in, you know, what kind of positions y'all hold, that kind of stuff. So if you have a chance, put that into the chat. I'd really be interested to see later on who all we had here and what kind of walks of life you come from. And I see a couple of notes about people that can't get on the call. Steve or Jim, could you contact Leah and see if she just has the wrong link for the Zoom? Okay. Alrighty, let's see, where was I? Oh yes, there's a couple of classroom rules, just kind of the usual stuff that you see when you're on a webinar. If you're not talking, please try to mute yourself. My co-hosts will be able to mute you if you accidentally forget, but since we will be listening to a lot of sounds and recordings, having any interference from people's like background noise can be really disruptive and make it hard to hear those. So it would be great if you could go ahead and check your phone or your computer right now and make sure you're on mute. Oh, and it looks like we're getting chats in about where people are coming from. Awesome. I'm seeing Oklahoma, ODWC, TPWD. Great. Looks like we've got a good mix of people. Awesome. We do have a mix of people that'll be on this webinar that have probably a mix of skill levels. So this is a judgment-free zone. Remember, there's no such thing as a dumb question. If you have that question, I guarantee you someone else has that same exact question. We're all here because we think birds are cool, so we all have that in common. So if anyone has questions, please be helpful and respectful. And don't be afraid to give wrong answers either. I'll have a couple of points where I ask y'all questions. So don't be afraid to answer and not be 100% sure that it's right. Wrong answers can be helpful to me because it lets me know where I might have made mistakes in telling y'all something, or maybe make me realize I forgot to tell you something. So wrong answers are cool, they're helpful. Just a little bit of background about how this was developed. So this training was originally for the Oaks and Prairies Joint Venture Grassland Bird Monitoring Program. We offer the Grassland Restoration Incentive Program in most of the counties that you see pictured in the map on the right. And this incentive program was intended to improve grassland habitat for a list of focal species of priority birds for this geography. Of course, we want to monitor and make sure that that program is doing what we hope it does. So back in 2013, we started a monitoring program in the counties that you see in the map on the right. The monitoring was modeled after the breeding bird survey. So if you're unfamiliar with what the Breeding Bird Survey is, it's essentially roadside routes on public roads. Along each of these routes, there are 50 points. Each of them are separated by about half a mile. You get out at each point and you do a point count. If you don't know what a point count is, that's where you stand in place for a set amount of time, typically 3 or 5 minutes, and you count how many birds you see or hear. So pretty easy methodology, but the species aren't necessarily easy. So our training was initially developed by Cliff Shackelford from Texas Parks and Wildlife, a state ornithologist. And he would usually cover identification in the classroom the night before. And we would use PowerPoint specimens, recordings, things like that in the classroom to help us get a grip on our focal species. And then the next morning we would go out in the field and actually practice those species. Obviously this year, this kind of methodology for training isn't exactly what we could employ. So we had to turn to other alternatives, and that's kind of what gave rise to this particular webinar. But because it did originate out of training for the purpose of surveys, we put a lot of focus on sounds, even more so than sometimes on visual identification. And this is because most bird surveys, you're going to detect most of your birds by hearing rather than by sight. Additionally, we will have some interactive sections to try to kind of make up for some of that missing field portion. So when we do get to those interactive sections, I'd really appreciate it if y'all could do your best to participate in the chat, because that's going to help me kind of gauge how well I'm doing and see if I need to fill in gaps. And hopefully it'll give you an idea of kind of the tools and techniques that you can use in the field later on. And last but not least, the first half is the hardest half. So when we get to that break about halfway through and you're like, oh my God, this is just too hard, it's okay. You're through the hardest part, and in the second half, we're gonna do some really easy species and probably some species you already know. And just a side note, the 2 photos you see on the right are field crews from 2013 to 2019. So you might see some familiar faces and might see some new faces in those.